Conversation series featuring artists, activists, and experts exploring civic engagement. Tonight, we bring you Dred Scott and Antwaun Sargent on dismantling Confederate monuments. And now, here's Sarah Bai, MCA Denver's Director of Programming.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Bai, Director of Programming at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Denver. And this is Practicing Citizenship, a program series MCA Denver is producing in conjunction with the exhibition Citizenship, a Practice of Society, on view now at MCA Denver. We are coming to you live every Wednesday night throughout the run of the exhibition. And tonight we present Dismantling Confederate Monuments with Dred Scott and Antwaun Sargent. In a recent study compiled by the Southern Poverty Law Center, since George Floyd's murder on May 25th of this year, 93 Confederate symbols were removed from public view, relocated, or renamed, bringing the total number of monuments and symbols removed since the 2015 Charleston church shooting to 146. This includes the removal of the Confederate flag from the Mississippi state flag and the toppling of the Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Compare this to just 9 Confederate symbols removed in the 100 years prior. Yet, nearly 1,800 Confederate symbols remain on public land, including place names, holidays, emblems, and monuments. Indeed, almost 700 Confederate monuments remain on view presently in the United States. Tonight, Antwaun Sargent and Dred Scott will talk about the future of dismantling these monuments that are so closely associated with the oppression and bondage of African Americans. We are so glad that you're tuning in, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube, and we invite you to be a part of this discussion. Antwaun and Dred will take your questions and comments at the end of their conversation. And however you're watching, you'll need to log in before you can comment. Click on the say something or write a comment box at the bottom of the live chat area to get started. If you're watching this from a TV, commenting is complicated, so you're better off doing it from a computer, a tablet, or a phone. And as questions come up throughout the talk, you can type them in the chat or save them for the end. We want to hear your voice, and we want to make this community a welcome space for conversation, so that we ask you be respectful in the comments. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. Dred Scott makes revolutionary art to propel history forward. In 1989, while he was a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, his art became the center of a national controversy over its use of the American flag, eventually becoming a defendant in a Supreme Court case declaring laws prohibiting the desecration of the American flag to be unconstitutional. His work has been included in exhibitions around the world. Some recent performances, which he will talk about tonight, have been presented at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and by Antenna in New Orleans. He is joined in conversation by Antwaun Sargent. Antwaun is an art critic and a writer who has contributed to the New York Times, the New Yorker, Vice, and many more. His first book, The New Black Vanguard: Photography Between Art and Fashion, was published last fall and is currently in its 3rd printing. His second book, Young, Gifted, and Black: A New Generation of Artists, which he edited, is available right now. Please welcome Dred Scott and Antwaun Sargent.
Hey, Dred, how are you?
Hey, Antwaun, I'm good. It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. How are you doing?
Me too. I'm great. There's just so much to talk about, I think, in this moment in relationship to monuments and citizenship. And so I wanted to not, waste any more time and sort of jump right in. What's really interesting to me about this exhibition, it's an exhibition where works that exemplify how artists act as citizens. And I like that sort of terminology, artists act as citizens, because often we think about it sort of the other way around, right? And I wanted to sort of start this conversation by asking you, what is the role of the artist citizen?
Well, I think that's, I have a complicated relationship with that question because a lot of progressive people have a sort of love-hate relationship with America. They're critical of a lot of the problems of America, but they fundamentally think there's something that's redeemable here. And I don't. I have a hate-hate relationship with America. It's a country that was founded on slavery and genocide, and it's based on exploitation and oppression. I try and make work and ideas that are for humanity as a whole. And so, I don't have a particular allegiance to this country. I feel sort of civic engagement is extremely important. And I think being a good citizen of the planet is extremely important, but I'm not trying to be a good citizen for America. And so the work that I make is, I don't privilege the United States of America above, England, China, Honduras, Guatemala. I mean, it's just there are big questions about how people actually get to a world where we could be freely associating human beings and not have a bunch of nations set on pitting us against each other and the wars that come from that.
And so, I mean, to sort of briefly follow up, so from that sort of positionality, what then for you is the role of the artist and of the citizen? Do you sort of separate those? Are those roles something that you sort of act out simultaneously? Because often, I ask that question because often, when it's really an interesting moment, obviously with the protests, the uprising, and the pandemic, where we've had to sort of constitute and redefine every aspect of society down to what is the expectation of the citizen and what is the expectation of the artist, right? And in each of those, we've seen sort of extraordinary acts from artists and we've seen extraordinary acts from citizens. And so I'm just sort of curious, as someone who's been doing this work for a very long time and thinking about both of those for a very long time, how do you see it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think artists are people. We're citizens of Earth, and those of us who want to be citizens of a particular country, that's what we are. And I think that, it's important to be engaged. It's like it would be really weird to say, well, okay, I'm very concerned about, say, police brutality, and I'm making art about that, but I don't have any connection to that in my other civic life or voting or whatever. And it would also be odd to just say, well, look, I just take care of the outrages of systemic white supremacy with sort of protests and stuff, but I don't want to have anything of that to creep into my art. For me, it is very much, I'm a person. I think about the world like we all do. And I happen to be lucky enough to have a disproportionate influence on society through making art. I happen to be part of the section of society that gets to work with their head much of the time. Most people don't. Most people are trying to put food on the table from the time they wake up to the time they go to sleep. Looked at on a world scale, many, billions of people are trying to survive on less than $2 a day. And most of them don't have the luxury to, be part of a Zoom call or have the technology that would facilitate that. In America, most people do have that relative freedom. But nonetheless, it's like if you're working it's like if you're an essential worker, you're an Amazon worker and you're working, 45, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, standing on your feet, hustling to get packages to people, or you're in a meat processing plant to get, chickens to people who are halfway around the country, you're probably not having a lot of energy to devote to thinking about the questions that we're discussing right now. And so what I, as an artist, do we reinforce those divisions that exist in the world, or do we actually try and tear them down? And so my work is looking at a lot of these big questions. I mean, you mentioned about George Floyd. It's like I've done for 20 plus years, I've done a lot of work that looks at how the police brutalize and oppress people and how people are resisting that. And I think, it would be very odd to, as an artist who cares about humanity and is a revolutionary, is trying to, is an activist too, to not engage some of these big questions with my art. And I encourage other artists to, think about the skills they've been lucky enough to acquire through a lifetime of experience and training and put those in the service of making the world better.
Yeah, one of the things in the publication for the exhibition, I was struck by sort of the way that you put citizenship, and I'm quoting, you say, I think citizenship isn't actually really easy to define on a certain level. It's a legal thing, right? In the history of this country, Black people and Indigenous people were not citizens. And because of that, they had no rights. I take my name, Dred Scott, from historic figure, Dred Scott, without the A. The plaintiff in the 1957 Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott versus Stanford, that pivoted around whether Black people, actually Africans, were citizens of the United States. It was only with the 14th Amendment that Black people became citizens. I wanted to sort of, before we dive into the work, into the exhibition, I thought it was important to sort of read that statement on citizenship in your name, because the very question of, of Black identity, right? What rights, what privileges, what is rooted sort of is evoked, sorry, in the name you chose as an artist. And I was wondering if you can kind of explain that process for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dred Scott was an enslaved man who got taken to a territory in St. Louis where slavery was where it was outlawed. And so he said, well, I should be free. And he sued for his freedom. And Dred was not the only enslaved person to do this. He became the most famous. But, and, he lost at the lower court and then won at the appellate court. And then that got appealed by his enslaver to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled quite bluntly, look, you can't even bring this case to court because you're not a citizen. You're basically property. And like a chair couldn't bring a case to court, neither can you. And if you read the Dred Scott decision, which, I encourage people to do, you can go to the Library of Congress. It's online. You could just download it. It is 41 pages of the most well thought out, articulated argument for white supremacy I've ever read. And it's deeply rooted in the U.S. Constitution and U.S. law and custom up until that point, and British law too. And so Chief Justice Taney was basically saying, look, let's not play around. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they did not think of Black people as citizens. These were objects to be conquered, and we could do with them what we want. And he, cites a lot of U.S. law and British law and says, this is our tradition. And one of the things he's very explicit about, he says, the founding fathers cared about their families. And if they did, there's no way they would allow Black people to be citizens, because if they were citizens, they'd have the right to own guns. And if the people that we enslaved own guns, they might point them at us. And so it was very clear that Black people were thought of from the foundations of this society as being people that were supposed to be subjugated and dictated to, and were basically dominated militarily. And so I think that it took a war to end the system of enslavement, the Civil War. I mean, it wasn't just a law, it took a war to do that. And the North didn't invade the South and say, this system is ideologically repugnant, we're going to stop it. It was like, no, there was a big fight that the South left to expand slavery. And then at the resolution of that, once the war was ended, the 14th Amendment was passed, and it said, well, anybody born in the United States is a citizen. And so that's a legal definition. But if you look at Breonna Taylor, it's very clear that Black people have not acquired the rights of citizenship to be even in your own damn home and asleep. And the police can storm into your apartment, murder you, initially charge your boyfriend with your murder, and then say, well, okay, the only real problem here is that one of the cops outside of her apartment shot the wallpaper, and he could have injured white people behind those walls. And so that's, there is the legal definition, but there's also the political application. And I think it's very clear in this society, a society where Black people were not thought of as human beings or citizens. We have those rights on paper, but they do not exist fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, I think with that ruling, or with that sort of grand jury sort of ruling, and sort of the logic behind sort of the charges, right? One officer charged was, I think what was so sort of naked about that was that they weren't charged with murdering her, right? There was no sort of charges around that. It was the rights, that we typically say that citizens have in America were actually conferred on another body, right? Outside of that apartment, right? Which in a really sort of fundamental way tells you that, we have people who have privileges beyond sort of that legal sort of classification. I wanted to say that, but I also wanted to move into the work you have in the exhibition. right?
Well, actually, I want to say one thing before we do, because you
Yep.
brought this up. It's like one of the things that I didn't mention about the Dred Scott decision. There, part of the wording in there is quite literally, there are no rights that a Black person has that a white man is bound to respect. That is almost verbatim, and I think there's no rights that a Black person has or something. But it is very clear that they viewed legally, the Supreme Court of the United States, their Chief Justice, viewed that Black people were not citizens, we were not humans, and those questions of rights are conferred by the government, and it did not apply to people with our skin color.
Right, and which on that note, like the title, which I think is important to read, of the work in the exhibition, "The Legacy of Slavery is in the Way of Progress and will be until America, which benefits from the legacy, has been replaced with a completely different society," right? It's a proposed sketch, right, for the site. It's a proposed sketch. Well, we're showing it, right? We're showing the.
It's not up right now, but I hope we could show it.
Yeah, it'd be great to show to give audiences. There you go. I was wondering if you could talk about why this particular, for you as an artist, why this particular proposal for that site.
Yeah. So this, this project was the New York Times approached me and several artists to propose, well, what should be done now that some of these, racist monuments, these white supremacist monuments are being taken down? What should be done with the space that's left? What should we put in their place? And obviously, if you ask artists, you're not just going to get a simple, like, we'll put a bronze of Muhammad Ali up there in its place. And so this is a photograph of what's known as Lee Circle. It's in New Orleans, and I was doing a lot of work in New Orleans. I was working on a project called Slave Rebellion Reenactment, which we'll talk about later, I hope. But it was a giant monument to Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee actually never set foot in New Orleans.
Right.
And so in the, I believe, 1890s, they constructed this giant 97-foot sort of pedestal and 35-foot monument to Robert E. Lee. So he's standing on this, smugly looking at everybody. And it's really, you got to understand, this is the South, and there is Jefferson Davis Highway. Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate States of America. There are many schools that are named after enslavers, and there are a whole legacy that's woven into the street names, the culture in that society. It's basically like, you cannot exist without this society saying 1840 was much better for us, and you should go back to that. And so here is this giant monument to the general who fought to preserve and expand enslavement in the United States. And so I was like, well, okay, we do need to talk about this, but I don't think that the question of just replacing another figure on top of that is actually what's needed. I think that these monuments to white supremacy are actually arguments for expanding it and preserving it in the present. They're not about the past. They're not just a reverence for the past, but they're about making a point today. And these monuments need to be knocked down. But what I was proposing is, look, let's make these inconvenient. We don't want to just bury this history. We want to actually talk about this history in order to move forward. And so what if the pedestal was knocked down and in the way of this major thoroughfare, so that you can't just have your normal egress around it, so that if you're driving, it is an obstacle and people have to confront that. And then what you can't see here is part of the proposal was to leave a giant hole in the ground, the length of the monument, which would not have any barriers that people could potentially fall into. And so obviously I knew this was not really going to be constructed, but the point of the dangers of keeping these monuments around is it causes tremendous harm in the present. And I think America wants to, or many in America want to the president certainly wants to say, look, this is a racist society and we're going to keep that. We're going to fight to keep it this way. And other people want to say, well, look, can't we just move on? And it's like, no, you actually can't. The wealth of labor that was stolen is in the trillions of dollars. And so when there's talk of reparations, it's not some paltry amount. It's, like 5.9 to $14.3 trillion is the amount of wealth that would need to be repaid if you were just paying that back. You would have to, do away with your prison system as you know it. You wouldn't have a situation where, it's like everything in America is shaped by its past of enslavement.
Right.
And to get beyond that, you actually have to confront how it's woven into you don't get Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd without the legacy of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't. It's really simple. And so, I think that these monuments, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about how Germany dealt with their fascist monuments and swastikas afterwards.
I think that we can use this time now to talk about it, but I wanted to sort of speak sort of briefly about your project, because it also disturbs our ideas around sort of when we construct a monument, right? And the ways that we think our thinking around monuments is a sort of completely sort of colonial sort of idea, right? And so you're thinking about, this idea of monumentality, right? This bigness, right? But you also are thinking about this idea of leisure, right? They're often in parks. They're often in these places where you go and you observe, right? Like, who has leisure time, right? Generally people with capital, people with wealth, right? And so what I appreciate about your proposal, it starts to sort of attack sort of some of those conceptual conceits that we don't often talk about when we talk about, say, replacing these monuments, right? And I think that, like, one of I know from experience, I was on the committee for the city of New York to replace the J. Marion Sims sculpture. We can have a whole conversation about that. But I think part of what happens in those conversations is that we end up swapping one for one, right? And so if we have Robert E. Lee, then we want Muhammad Ali, right? And I don't think we don't often trouble the notion, right? Or the conditions in which those monuments had come to be, right? And I think in the way that you make it difficult, right, to sort of circumvent and this potential, of danger, and to really sort of have people grapple with, not only the figure, but the legacy, right? I think is important, right? And I think that, you alluded earlier to Germany, and I spent a lot of time in high school and college studying German in Germany, and I spent a lot of time, with these monuments. And I think that, like, the one that and I'll have you share yours, but the one that really sort of spoke to me was the one in Kassel, Germany, where they had this fountain that was kind of donated to the city by a wealthy patron who had Nazi ties, or by a Jewish patron, and then the Nazis came through and toppled they found out a Jewish person donated the fountain. The Nazis came through and they toppled the fountain instead of rebuilding the fountain, right? As a gesture, right, of solidarity and openness, etc. They inverted the fountain, and they put it into the ground, right? As a comment on obviously they're dealing with negative space and things like that, but as a comment on the ways in which the water, right, which runs through the city, was contaminated, right? There was a legacy here that has contaminated this space, right? And we should consider that space every time. We should consider that legacy every time we think about the foundation of this city, right? And I think that like Germany has this just sort of really interesting way to, of thinking about monuments that is not just sort of a one-to-one.
Yeah. I mean, one of the really effective ways that they have memorialized or commemorated or discussed the Holocaust is at least in Berlin, but I think it's all over Germany, there are these markers that are, about the size of a brick that have the names of Jewish people that are embedded in the sidewalk. They're very, very subtle, but they're all over. And then it becomes overwhelming that there were 6 million people who were disappeared here. And Germany is not going to forget that. I mean, yes, there's a tiny handful of neo-fascists that are raising their heads and becoming quite popular. And ironically, they view Trump as one of their great leaders now.
They recently had a rally for him in Berlin.
Which had the Iron Cross with his face in the middle. Which I mean, that tells you both who he is, but who they are. But there's a small minority, because the thing is, in Germany, from a young age, there is discussion in the schools about the fascist legacy, and it's viewed as a terrible, terrible thing, never to be repeated. You can't get a basic education in Germany without knowing a lot about who Hitler was, who the Third Reich was. And whereas in America, you can get a master's degree and have no clue about slavery. You could consider yourself an educated person and never have any basic understanding of the history of slavery. Half the people in this country can't even identify that the cause of the Civil War was slavery. I mean, and so
it's not even taught, in certain southern schools, And
yet there is all this sort of memorializing, Southern. I mean, the Confederate battle flag was literally a state flag. There are all these, I think, 1,000+ monuments to white supremacy and the Confederacy all over the place. There is, you can't in Germany drive down Hitler Highway. You can drive down Jefferson Davis Highway in many states. There was when I started working on slave rebellion reenactment, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. There were all these legacies and monuments to the Confederacy, including a marker for the last meeting place of the Confederate States of America that Jefferson Davis attended in, I believe, 1865. But it called him President Davis. There's probably markers where Hitler had his last meeting with the Reich, but it doesn't say Chancellor Hitler. It would say Adolf Hitler. Calling him President Davis is actually a venerated place. And so the conception of monument actually has to deal with history and space and how you would think about that and how you want that to be living. And so having a big dude on a horse is one vision. Another vision is living monuments, legacy, things that involve and get into people in different ways that challenge and rethink space, as you were talking about, and actually make people confront, what certain histories are, and not just like do this one for one. I mean, if there were, monuments to Toussaint Louverture and Muhammad Ali and Ray Charles or W.B. Du Bois. I mean, those would be nice, but it's like that's really not going to actually outdo the legacy of white supremacy that is affecting everybody's daily lives. And so, let's have some of those, but we need something radically different.
I mean, the part of the conversation around monuments, is should they exist at all, Should there be, because I think what you just touched on really was this idea of the reason why those monuments matter is because of the ways in which those monuments are symbols of the ways in which power is being enacted on certain bodies, in this country, and not being enacted on others, And I think that, like, for me, I mean, in my journey sort of around the J. Marion Sims, scenario, but also just thinking about this stuff, it really, I'm like, should we have any monuments at all? Becomes a question for us to sort of grapple with, and then in sort of listening to your, you speak, I also, thought about sort of the ways in which you use performance, in the enactment work, but also in a work like Decision, from 2012. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to the ways in which you use performance and how that sort of deal with our ideas around sort of, say, a living monument, or re-engaging monuments, or engaging monuments in different ways, or engaging that space in which, important events happen in sort of ways that really sort of have a real sort of, feeling and connection and spirit to them.
Yeah. Well, Dred Scott decision, which, I mean, I think I supplied 4 images. So hopefully as I talk, we can go through a couple of them. But it was a performance that had, 3 key elements. One was me reading the verbatim text of the Dred Scott decision to an audience. 2 was there were 4 nude Black performers who were being guarded by live German Shepherd dogs, or corralled by live German Shepherd dogs, which evokes the image of dogs from, slave catching dogs, but also dogs from Bull Connor in 1963, and people who were protesting Jim Crow but had dogs sicked on them. And then the audience was an active element of the work, and they were lined up, and they had to go past this line of Black men to get into voting booths. And when they were in the voting booth, there was an ethical question about the relationship between slavery, mass incarceration, and voting. And so, and they had to say, I mean, this, like, do they push through this line of men? Do they walk around them? Do they pretend they're not there? Sometimes the men were lying down. Sometimes the men were going up and staring at them because they were performers and they weren't just, doing any one thing. And I think the question of, for me, one thing I really think about a lot is how the past both sets the stage for the present, but how it exists in the present in new form. And so this question of making the Dred Scott decision, it's not just a historic problem. It's not just a bad ruling that happened in 1857 that, became part of the catalyst for the Civil War. It is something that lives to today. And the question is, do we just pretend that doesn't happen? Do we not read the history because it's uncomfortable? Do we literally step over Black bodies and just go on voting as if that's going to stop this? Because the thing is, anybody coming to this performance, they know it's a Dred Scott performance. They didn't know what they were going to see. They didn't know they were going to be part of it in some way. But they basically, I'm sure, would have thought, slavery is bad, and I don't like mass incarceration, and I don't like what the police are doing to people in broad brushstrokes. But then many people would then say, well, I voted, and I'm going to vote for Obama, so I'm good. And it's like, well, there's nothing that voting was going to do that was going to, in this artwork, it's not going to stop the performance. And in reality, it has not stopped the mass incarceration, the warehousing of descendants of enslaved Africans. And at the time, 11% of young Black men aged 20 to 34 were imprisoned or something like that. So 11% of Black people, and 1/3 can expect to be imprisoned at some point in our lifetime. That is a damning indictment of this society. And if all you think is, well, I vote every 4 years, or if you vote, in the primary, the midterms, you vote every 2 years, that's not stopping that. And so the thing is, how does Dred Scott live with us today, and what do people do about it? And what is their rights and responsibility, and how does that performance? And one of the things with the performance is, if people filled out this survey and voted, as it were, they got a gift, and the gift was a print, and the print was actually had a reproduction of a lithograph of Dred Scott that was part of it. There was a small print. It was 6 by 9 inches. And then it had a text of the survey, and encouraged people to put it up in their apartment or house and have conversations about it. So it was trying to extend the ideas of the artwork outside of the performance space and make the audience active ambassadors for having these conversations. And so that's, for me, what I think is really interesting about the potential for Monument, is where it's not just you have a passive audience observing some statue, but where you have people that are actively thinking about the ideas and participating in them in some way. And I'm not going to everybody's house and having the conversation. I'm not dictating how they have the conversation, but it's more like, look, this is your responsibility. You've seen something in this performance. Be part of the conversation for thinking about how this legacy affects the present.
And we're having this conversation about monuments and citizenship, and how, those two things are intertwined. Recently, the Mellon Foundation announced that they're going to give $250 million to different organizations around the country, and artists and folks, to reimagine what monument should be in America, right?
Yeah.
Significant gesture. there are a few things that I thought, and I'll let you respond. One of which, what would Dred Scott do with all of that money? I really want to know, but I also want to know. It also seems at a moment like the one we're in, right, where we have unbelievable suffering. We're living in a pandemic. We're living in a sort of, like it feels like some, apartheid every day.
Yeah.
That $250 million could be used in a way that it has a more direct impact, right? That's one of the sort of arguments. Then there are also the other argument around the amount of money that Mellon gave to art organizations, $24 million, and the amount of money that they're using in this project, $250 million, right? And so these are just sort of numbers that are, that are out there, right? And these are sort of actions. And I wanted to sort of know, one, what your sort of thought about this sort of significant contribution to this, and what would you do if you had that kind of money to reimagine monuments?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's like art takes a long time for me to conceive, to think about, and so
it was a bit unfair of a question, but
no,
it was a fun question. Yeah.
No, it's a good question actually. Because it does get at the heart. Well, okay, if significant resources are potentially going to be given to interesting artists to reimagine monuments, that's a good thing. And so, what do we do with that? Including weighing up that, well, as you posed, well, there were $250 million to monuments, $24 million to arts organizations. How do we value art, and what if they do that? And so, I think though that the bigger thing is, part of why this is happening is many areas of society are grappling with how do we end, or at least modify, lessen white supremacy. And that's, everything from towns that had never seen a Black person having demonstrations of white people saying Black Lives Matter, which I think is great, to Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the key perpetrators of the sort of stealing of Black wealth for the housing bubble that happened in 2008, 2009, and the predatory lending practices, Jamie Dimon declaring Black Lives Matter. Well, that's a goddamn hollow gesture for the people who created the problem in a certain sense. I'm glad that he's made that gesture, but we're not, so $250 million to monuments is not going to end white supremacy, but there are people that are making a commitment to say, okay, we have to do our part. And so I'm glad Mellon's doing that. The question is going to be, are we just going to get, say 250 statues of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Muhammad Ali, or are we going to get some people that say, well, okay, what could we do to really force this question and create, frankly, some challenging art, some of which people hate. And because, not necessarily because it's a waste of money, but because it makes them uncomfortable. Right. It's like,
what's so sort of interesting about this is that, and it's in the city, New York has the wrong process, I believe, hands down, for the monument stuff. I mean, it's like I have nightmares about that process. But one of the interesting things, and I don't know if you know this or not, and I don't know if it came out or not, but Simone Lee won the competition.
Yeah.
And by the city's sort of guidelines, right? But there are other sort of factors, that led to a Black victory, angel with an eternal flame. I'm not even, I mean, I'm not even sort of trying to be flippant about it, being sort of installed, right? Because the city didn't have the stomach to sort of first of all, break very clearly from a legacy, right? And also to not sort of make art or put art there that was clearly about sort of removing and presenting Black women, removing Black women from a narrative as a way to sort of represent them, right? By a Black woman, in repose, in a way that was not sort of this one-to-one, again, connection, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like that be like, and I understand that the Sims sort of monument was a very particular thing. There was a lot of community organizing, and I'm not dismissing that at all, right? But what I'm saying is that it goes back to this question of space, right? And it goes back to this question of who owns that space, and it goes back to this question of like, you know, the available images of power that we have, right, are all sort of white supremacists, even when you're thinking about Black representations, right? And so often, so in a way, it shouldn't be surprising if you do end up with, you know, the figure, right, the powerful Black figure who defied all odds in these different places, because we only have certain select ideas of what it means to be empowered, right? And what it means to have an empowered figure. And so I think that like on the surface of it, it's like, yes, give artists, you know, I don't even know if it's the role of the artist to be making monuments, right? Like, I think that like we're talking about this idea of civic engagement, right? That seems more like it seems in some ways like a civic project, right? That it just involves a lot more than, say, an artist who has an studio practice, right? Those, I think that like I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that like those are different processes. But I sort of say all of that to say that it's an interesting sort of proposition when you say we're going to give artists money to sort of reimagine, and then we're going to give the community money to engage in an act of citizenship on a particular plot of land and be okay with that, right?
Yeah.
And so it creates this sort of murky sort of confusing of the roles, right?
Yeah.
Because often the proposals that we got, the community members was like, these people are not from this community. You know, it became sort of this tribal sort of thing, and I'm just sort of like talking through this because it gets so layered, right? And it gets in a good way and in a bad way.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, Simone is a great artist. She's a really, as you know, and I think many in the audience probably will know her, but some might not. She's a really brilliant artist, and actually, some of her work is community engaged. I mean, she's an artist who did, Black women artists for Black Lives Matter, which was this sort of, brilliant intervention in museum space, and she's done work that's actually dealt with the legacy of Black nurses and doctors and
Sims too.
Yeah. And so, she thinks a lot about these questions, and I think it's just the process was difficult. But I do think your point of, who has power, who doesn't have power, who controls space, and what people's spontaneous understanding of what monuments are and what they do and how they function, it's going to take work in a society that's like basically oppressed people for all this time to think that, okay, how are we going to work through that to get monuments that we really are useful, that are transformative? And so, I do think that it is a good challenge to put before people and have some resources. I think, but this question of community involvement, Slave Rebellion reenactment was a project that was not a monument, but it was a community engaged performance that had 350 Black people marching for 24 miles over the course of 2 days on the outskirts of New Orleans, reenacting the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the history of the United States. It was very community involved. But I, live in New York. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans to do the project. I spent, months and months there. But I was an outsider. People in New Orleans felt very proprietary about the history. The reason we even know this history is because of one particular person, Leon Waters, who had family history and researched it. And then he and some colleagues published a book about it. And he feels a great deal of ownership. And he's a good guy. And but it was like, here's this outsider coming in and they're like, well, we should be able to determine how it, and so there were all these issues of participation, who belongs, and it was really community involved. These were not just a bunch of actors in costumes. This was built over, years of time where people were actively deciding to embody freedom and emancipation. This wasn't a project about slavery. This was a project about overthrowing the system of enslavement. And, this was a situation where these issues of how the community sort of owns space, owns history, owns time, is very, there are complex issues that were involved in that. And I mean, ultimately the project was quite successful. But I think this question of this history is not just for whatever local community controls it in a certain sense. Yeah. And I think part of the thing is, like with slave rebellion reenactment, it was the enslaved who were rebelling in 1811. None of them were from New Orleans. They were all Africans and Caribbeans. I mean, some of them were born in Haiti or Saint Domingue, but they were, Akan, they were Congos, they were, Bambaras, and so this is this question of how we look at this history, which is the foundation of the United States. I think that looking at these Confederate monuments and taking them down and building new monuments that address questions of inequality, but particularly racism, those are not issues that are just for whatever place the artwork is cited in. And it's not just that people who are untrained but have deep ties to a community have the best understanding of what the community actually needs. And so, Yeah,
I mean, I think that even in particularly with the J. Marion Sims project, the women who were ultimately experimented on and tortured were not from those communities, right? Like those are, and so I think that, like, when we talk about a space, we really have to be taught, and we're talking about a space in relationship to history. I think that, like, for me, one of the things that I was trying to do on that committee was to make sure that the space was able to reverberate Blackness and be, in a way, a beacon for a history that is, frankly, all over this country, all over this land, right?
Yes.
And so, but that was seen as some sort of kind of conceptual gesture, right? And you had a real community and real pain. I know we're running low on time. I would really like for us to show the video for this work, and then I have one more question before we go to the audience.
Okay.
Freedom or death! We're gonna end slavery! Join us! Join us! Freedom! 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 Liberté! Liberté!
And so I said I have one question, but I actually have two.
Okay.
I want to, the first question is, there's a work that you made in 2015. It's called "The Man Was Lynched by Police Yesterday." It's a black and white flag. The lettering is in white. It's a take on a flag that the NAACP made in Manhattan, and it has become, in sort of our social media time, and we're spending so much time on our phones and on the internet, and it's image driven. It's become sort of sadly, and sort of in a really sort of fucked up way, it's become this sort of digital monument, right? Like if that's even a thing, but every time a tragic circumstance of police injustice, violence that leads to the death of a Black person, I see this flag, as a peer, simultaneously across the internet and social media as a way to sort of mark and spread the word.
Yeah.
Um, and so I know that was not the intention, right, of the work. And I mean, you can't even predict that. But I do see in sort of the way in which it's used and when the sort of second life, right? Because the first life it exists in museums and exists in sort of the physical world, right? And sort of has a digital sort of life. Can you talk about sort of the ways in which that sort of digital life has given you insights as an artist, has helped you sort of rethink some of the questions that led you, if at all, to the creation of this work in 2015?
Well, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's, you know, I made this work after Walter Scott was killed, and it was made pretty quickly after that. I mean, a lot of my work takes a long time to make, and I think about it for a while. And this was made very quickly. It was from concept to the fact that it existed was, I mean, I had the artwork finished in about a week, and the production of the actual banner took about 3 more weeks. So it took about a month.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really fast for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this is a really cool work, but nobody's going to pay that much attention to it. And when it was first shown in a gallery in Des Moines, Iowa, you know, the show was a good show, and, you know, people didn't care that much about it or notice it. It got shown outside of Jack Shainman. This photo is outside of Jack Shainman Gallery, which is a gallery in New York City, in Chelsea. Jack Shainman is a really well-respected gallery. And
on the occasion of Four Freedoms, right?
Four Freedoms, which was at the time a super PAC and is now a nonprofit that was launched by Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Gottesman to have artists do civic engagement. And so it just happened that this show was going on, and I asked, could the work be included in the show after the police murdered Philando Castile and Alton Sterling in 2 separate incidents separated by 36 hours? Mm-hmm. And they said yes, which is unusual. And so it was that show that everybody was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Mm-hmm. And started gramming and regramming and tweeting and retweeting it. And then the Whitney Museum bought it. It was on the front page of the NewYorkTimes.com. But then George Floyd happens. Mm-hmm. And then it is, I mean, it's everywhere. And it's, you know, I'm happy when my work doesn't just exist in a museum and gallery space. That's actually, I think artists, we often limit ourselves to just being, you know, in this, you know, white cube. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad when my work resonates and gets outside of those spaces sometimes. I mean, most of my work shows in galleries and museums, and I'm happy for that engagement. Mm-hmm. But I also like, you know, being on the streets in important ways. But this, and how it becomes, I mean, a meme almost is, I'm still processing. I mean, I like the fact that it becomes a sign for people, and it resonates, and it allows them to talk about this history and the connection between the lynching terror, the racist terror, and the police, and that past and our present. And so I'm glad it resonates, but it is a way in which sort of it almost becomes a replacement for action. And and the thing is, we're living at this, what I think is a truly beautiful time. The protests around George Floyd were the best thing that's happened in my life, all over the country, or at least my conscious adult thinking life. Mm-hmm. You know, where people in small towns and big cities, you know, white, Black, Latinx, all ethnicities, wealthy, not wealthy, were standing up to entrenched white supremacy. And the police, instead of saying, damn, we screwed up, we choked somebody to death on camera, they were like, no, that's our job. And we're going to violently attack anybody who dares to challenge us. We were going to tear gas you, we'll mace you. If you're an 80-year-old frail man, we're going to knock you over with riot shields. And the people keep coming back wave after wave. You have Portland, where you have the wall of moms. And then, you know, it's really an interesting situation where there is this tremendous level of activism, including in the face of white supremacists crossing state lines with automatic weapons and murdering people. And so it's really good. But then this work exists in the context of that. And it's, you know, I'm glad it's resonant, but it's also a way in which, you know, people can't use this. I mean, it's like, I wanted museums to show this work at this time, and I offered to have display copies to any museum in the country that was a significant museum that would show it. None took me up on that offer. Museums in Europe were showing it, but museums here refused to, including museums that own the work, museums that collect me, and yes, there's.
But you know what they showed? They showed Arthur Jafa's "The Love Semester"
Yeah.
His death, and I mean, I we're like running over, but it's interesting that they would show that work and not say another work, and I'll just sort of leave it there, right? Like, because I just think that like there's a way in which we consume Black suffering in this country. And there's a way in which that this work, if you display this work, it puts you, you're implicated, right? And it's a stance that, frankly, museums have not been willing to take, right? Like, I think people have spotted the idea that they said Black Lives Matter, but then they don't matter. And then then the next question, where do they matter? Not in your collection, not on your board, not in your curatorial staff, not in your, like not in your education department, not, you know what I mean? Like we can, like, so what does that mean, right? It just becomes sort of this like empty sort of gesture. And that's what I really sort of love about this particular work, because it implicates you, right? And I think your work has this ability to implicate, right? And I know I said one more question, and I would not forgive myself if we didn't have a discussion about for me, a similar work, 1989's What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag, right? This work, famously led to a Supreme Court case that, in fact, expanded our rights as citizens, right? That decision, right, allowed us to desecrate a U.S. flag, right? It allowed, or do whatever else, right, to a U.S. flag. And so it expanded our rights, our free speech rights. I wanted to, which is significant because often artworks don't do that, right? That's not, that's not a thing that art usually do. I wanted to end on this because I wanted to sort of bring the conversation full circle in terms of what did this work then and now for you as the creator say about the role of citizenship and how we have to, and how we should enact citizenship.
Well, this was an installation for audience participation, and so it consisted of a photo montage on the wall, which had text that said, "What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag?" And below that were images of South Korean students burning American flags, holding signs that said, "Yankee, go home, son of a bitch." And below that was flag-draped coffins. And then there were blank books on shelves that people could write responses to the question. And below that was a flag on the ground that people had the option of standing on as they wrote their responses. And so people wrote all sorts of responses. Some were really short, a sentence or two. Some were a whole page. Some were drawings. Some people said on a pole. Some people, in a dog's mouth. Some threatened to have me killed. Other people talked about how their experience in Germany taught them that there's too much Americans have too much trouble about their flag. And other people talked about how the police killed their brother and then walked over and kicked over the body to make sure that the nigger was dead. And that policeman was wearing a flag, and they were happy for the opportunity to talk about this and stand on the flag. So it gave voice, it enabled people to engage on this question of what is the United States, what is the U.S. flag, what is U.S. patriotism. It wasn't just my thoughts on the flag, it was actually what all sorts of, it says, this flag I'm standing on stands for everything oppressive in this system, the murder of the Indians and all the oppressed around the world, including my brother who was shot by a pig who kicked over his body to, quote, make sure the nigger was dead. This pig was wearing the flag. Thank you, Dred Scott, for this opportunity. And so, it allowed people that had that sentiment and that experience back in 1988, 1989 to talk about that on an equal footing with the George Bushes of the world. And that was really, it forced other people to engage those questions, because it wasn't just people writing and then nobody reading. People could come see and engage with the work after that and see what other people had written in it. And there was a running dialogue in lots of different languages and over the course of it. And the thing is, this work was, denounced by the president of the United States, George Bush. Herbert Walker Bush publicly called the work disgraceful, which I thought was a tremendous honor. And the work was then, outlawed by Congress. And then I and others defied that law by burning flags on the steps of the Capitol. It was about much more than just my art. I mean, the law wasn't just about my artwork, but it was the United States was trying to make patriotism compulsory and having only one permissible view of the flag. And so by defying the law and going to the Supreme Court, it actually then was decided that you could do whatever you want with the flag. And actually, a lot of artists filed what's called an amicus brief. It's a friend of the court brief that said that they have a unique understanding and they want to help the court understand it. So Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Richard Serra, Faith Ringgold, John Hendricks, and many other artists, Vito Acconci, all contributed to this brief. Artists who've used the flag in their work. And so they said, look, we've used the flag and we don't want to have our ideas criminalized, and we're worried about what this law is doing. And so through that, the law was struck down, and so people can do whatever they want with the flag. They can wear it as a lapel pin, they could fly it proudly, or they could put it on the ground and have other people stand on it as they engage with what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag.
Perfect. We're going to take a few questions. And then we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Dred, for having this conversation with me, because it's, on everyone's mind as we, gear up, or people are voting, right? So as we are in an election, right? I mean, I just keep saying that it's not, the election is over on November 3rd. People are voting now. So these are questions that we are, they seem more and more important with every election. And, not saying that voting is the only thing that we can do, but it is the first, it's one of the, sort of easier things that one could do. So, I employ all of you to vote. And with that, we will take a question.
Yeah.
All right, I'm back, and we have some questions that are coming in from the audience, but some people are saying that they yield their time to you, Antwaun and Dred, which makes sense. This is a riveting conversation. I do have one question I want to ask you as we wrap up here today, which so nice to end on Antwaun speaking about your 1989 work, how the proper way to display American flag and the way that it expanded Americans' rights. Do you think that there's the potential with this gift from the Mellon Foundation to do the same kind of work, to change and do real good and expand the rights of citizens in the United States by reimagining monuments?
Well, I think it's funny because ironically, this work, which is a pivotal work, is basically a banned work. It can't be shown. It is taught in art history classes, in foundations art history classes. It's in part of, you look at Art History 101 textbook. If you were to show this work today at a museum with this current administration, the president of the United States would be calling for your museum to close. You would have armed fascists that would probably be threatening your staff. And I think that's worth the risk to do, but museums are not doing that. And I think that actually tells a lot about where things are at, where, it's like The Clash, a band that I really like, said, in one of their songs, Know Your Rights, you have the right to free speech as long as you're not dumb enough to actually try it. And so, I think that, it's like we have these rights, but I also think that if you make work that challenges this status quo, there's going to be a price to pay. And I hope with this Mellon Foundation, people could expand rights and reimagine things. And I think that will be possible. But I also think, as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. It never did and it never will. People have to actually be willing to take some risks and to challenge some stuff. The people that are on the streets around George Floyd were risking being shot by the police. Journalists had their eyes put out. Photographers had their cameras smashed and their eyes put out. ordinary people were brutalized. They have, batons that were hit them upside the head and stuff, and were, had police that were refusing to wear masks during a pandemic and were warehousing people in confined spaces in jails. This was really courageous what people were doing, but that needs to be replicated. If you're challenging something as entrenched as police brutality and white supremacy and the rights of the police to brutalize and murder people with impunity, you're going to run up against a police force and a government that says, no, that's what we do. We're not changing that. You have to really be willing to fight for it. Much the way the people in the civil rights movement were risking tremendous amount and some were killed actually getting expansion of rights. And I think if you're making artwork that doesn't take the same risks, that doesn't challenge people, that doesn't risk, I can't put that in my community. I might lose my job. Who cares about your damn job? It's like, or I might have people that don't speak to me nicely when I go to the grocery store. Well, suck it up, Let's make some work that really gets to the heart of some of this and be willing to have the difficult conversations because, it's like, well, if talking about white supremacy makes you uncomfortable, well, I'm sorry, you're just going to kind of have to be uncomfortable because, getting a phone call that your child was murdered by the police is actually pretty damn uncomfortable. And I don't want to have to have people get that phone call or read about their loved ones in the news or be parts of more marches or use my work as a signifier for how the police are terrorizing people anymore. Let's actually end some of this systemic brutality.
I think that is right. Like I think that the problem with monuments is that we've often and too long have thought of them as these static, objects, right? And I think what Dre is talking about is you need to, imbue or embed these monuments with that sort of critical questioning, right? And so if you look at something and you don't come away from it with with those sort of questions, those sort of what is my rights, what rights might I have over someone else, what power should we all have, what power shouldn't we have, what are the limitations of certain sorts of activism, how do we exceed identity politics around division, all of those things have to be embedded in these things. We have to be living in that way, right? I think one of the things that we did not discuss, which I think is really important around these monuments, is that most of them were not made during the civil rights era. Or during the
Civil War era. They weren't made in the 1800s. They were made in the 1900s.
Exactly, in the 1800s and 1900s. And so even when you think about sort of the creation, the construction, right? Like these monuments were really a way about affirming white power throughout the United States. I mean, there's so many. If you look at one of the maps, I think the New York Times put out around where the monuments were in the country, right? So many of them in the North, right? So many of them are in places where there was no civil rights or Civil War history, right? In that same sort of way, right? So it can't be about quote unquote heritage, right? And then we also get into questions of like whose heritage, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that I wasn't sort of trying to say that $250 million is a significant amount of money, but especially in a moment like this. But I really do hope that the Mellon Foundation has the stomach to really have these real difficult conversations, because as Dredd, that work, 1989 work, and Dredd's work, speaks to, is that there has to be some risk in the ways in which we are thinking about the sort of visualization, really, of public space in America, right? Because that's what the question becomes.
Yeah. And I'll take this last question that's coming in. This is from Heather. She asks, is there an existing monument that comes to mind that embodies what a monument could do or be?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
For me, it's really, it goes back to this question of Germany. I'll go back to my castle monument. I just thought that it was just very smartly done, and it did not what I did say was in the sort of inverting of the monument, right? What it did was it did not erase the violent Nazi gesture, right? The gesture was, we're removing this fountain, we're going to destroy this. So the act of destruction, right, that violence has been incorporated inside of that monument, right? And so you're getting both, right? You're seeing the violence, but you're also seeing the response to it, right? And I think that, like, having that sort of visceral sort of duality there, and having to sort of grapple with that duality when you are in that space, right, is something that, Germany has really figured out, right? It's not sort of, generations from now, you go to 103rd Street or, 10th Street in Central Park, and you see this, Black victory, and you don't get the real sort of stakes of what happened in that space, right? Or why would that monument, the fight around that monument, right? I think that, like, we have a real problem in this country around history and getting it straight, right? And so I don't trust. I just simply don't trust the ways in which we tell history in this country, right? And I don't think that a monument can, a monument that is sort of predicated on this one-to-one, the swapping out of white power for Black power, or the swapping out of, this fashion for that fashion, will stand the test of time.
Yeah, well, I'd say a couple things. First, can we show the very brief video clip of the and from Nazi Germany, of how some of those monuments and architecture were dealt with? So, yeah, that's there. The equivalent in America still exists all over this country. There are 1,000 white supremacist monuments to the Confederacy around, and they need to all be removed. They need to be taken down. And the Germans have actually done a quite good job of teaching about the history of Nazism and fascism without having monuments supporting it all over the country. And so step one, we do need to get rid of all of the ones that exist. And people who are talking about, that's my heritage. Well, first of all, if your heritage is supporting slavery, that's not a good heritage to be proud of. And secondly, we're not talking about erasing the history. We want to actually focus on that history, but we don't want to perpetuate that history. And the other thing I will say is the one monument that I really, really like is the Equal Justice Initiative, a monument to lynching, the lynching memorial, and that Brian Stevenson, the great death row lawyer, civil rights lawyer, has built in Montgomery, Alabama. That is a memorial to people who were victims of lynching. And part of what I really like about it, it is very abstracted. And so there are these, you start walking in and there are these sort of brown, cubes, basically, or not, it's like technically a rectangular prism, that are hanging, and you're at eye level with them, and they're just locations and names of people that are on them. And then as you walk through it, they stay at the same height, but you go down. And so then there are these basically brown, cubes that are hanging above you. And it's just the locations and each one represents a county where there was lynching. And so both the physical experience of seeing that and the enormity of it is very powerful. But what's really smart about it is they have duplicates of all of those, rectangular prisms, these, that they want people in the counties where the lynching happens to adopt and take back. So the memorial in Montgomery will stay as it is, but the duplicates will then be cited in hundreds of counties across the U.S. It's a really, it's a really smart smart monument, I think, or memorial, I think is actually a better way to say it. It's sort of a sacred space that is memorializing all these people that were lynched, and you get a sense of the enormity of this and the history of it. And so yeah, but I also think that as much as I really truly love this, and I think it is really, really smart, I think that some of what Antwaun was saying about not doing a one-for-one, actually trying to think of how the history exists in the present, and how, I mean, with the one in Castle, where it actually acknowledges and makes people, remember and not forget the violence of the Nazis, but then actually says we in the present are actually going in a different direction. I think it's a complicated task, and artists and society needs to make ourselves up to that. And I do think artists can imagine what that could be, but it's not simple. And the easy solution is, oh yeah, we'll just stick a Frederick Douglass up there and we're done, we're good, right? And that's what many people are going to clamor for, and the people in the arts that can see the limitations of that are going to have to fight to say, no, that's actually not what we need. That will be sort of in the way. We need to actually have things that make people confront this history, this past, but also have a path forward.
I also just wanted to briefly say that in the video that you showed, the 10 seconds, very clear video, what that evoked in me was this idea that people say, oh, it's our heritage and we should just put them in museums. And that's not the role of museums. Yeah. And I think that we really need to be really clear about what our museums stand for. And we should not have a bunch of racist Confederate statues in our museums as, just because they're quote unquote history. They're not history. As we discussed, this stuff was mostly made in the 18th and 19th century, right? And so
19th and 20th century.
Yeah, 19th and 20th century, sorry. And we need to sort of have a real, honest sort of dialogue in quote unquote, everyone's using the word reckoning around what we stand for, what our institutions stand for, what we should have standing in our public space, right? I think I think the Monument Project, what's brilliant about the monument, potentially about this Monument Project, is that it gets again at the central questions, right? And I think that hopefully that is that's the sort of brilliance in this, right? That you have to go through all of these steps to think through all of these questions before you do get, an object or a monument in a particular space, right? Because I think it allows, for us to engage in an act of citizenship, and we have we have a object as a result, right? And so I hope that's where we're going. I hope we're going to endeavor to engage the complicated. We're going to endeavor to engage the complex, the real sort of darkness of the history, right? So we could find some light, right? I hope that's where we're going with this. I really do.
Well, that is a beautiful place to end this conversation tonight. Dred, Antwaun, I want to thank you both for being here, for participating in this conversation, for being a part of the exhibition. And thank you all, for those of you who are tuning in at home, for sticking with us, and have a wonderful night. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Good night.